In May 1945, as the war in Europe came to its violent conclusion and Berlin collapsed under the weight of artillery and fire, the continent stood physically shattered and politically uncertain. The Soviet Union had borne the heaviest burden of the conflict, losing entire regions, industries, and an estimated tens of millions of lives in a struggle that had reached the outskirts of Moscow and the banks of the Volga. Across the vast Soviet landscape, reconstruction would take years, perhaps decades, and the psychological memory of invasion ran deeper than the ruins themselves. Within the Kremlin, this memory shaped every calculation about what the post-war order must look like. Joseph Stalin did not interpret victory as a simple triumph of arms, but as confirmation of a harsh geopolitical lesson that had defined Russian history for centuries. Twice within a generation, foreign armies had advanced through Eastern Europe toward the Soviet heartland, exploiting open plains and unstable governments along the western frontier. To Stalin, security could no longer depend on diplomatic assurances or temporary alliances forged in wartime necessity. It required strategic depth, reliable governments on neighboring borders, and a political system strong enough to mobilize society without hesitation. Unlike the Western leaders who spoke publicly of democratic renewal and economic cooperation, Stalin approached the peace from a position of guarded suspicion. He had risen to power through decades of internal struggle, political maneuvering, and the ruthless consolidation of authority after Lenin's death, and he understood that power was maintained not through sentiment, but through structure. The centralized Soviet state, hardened by purges and industrial mobilization in the 1930s, had survived the greatest military assault in modern history. In Stalin's view, that system had proven its effectiveness, and its expansion into a protective sphere around the Soviet Union appeared not as ambition, but as necessity. As Europe celebrated the end of war, the foundations of a new division were already forming beneath the surface. The Red Army's presence across Eastern Europe was more than a military fact. It was leverage, influence, and strategic insurance against the uncertainties of the future. What Western observers interpreted as expansionism, Stalin considered prevention, a barrier against another catastrophe rising from the West. The Iron Curtain had not yet been named, but in Moscow's calculations, its outline was already clear. When the Red Army advanced westward in 1944 and early 1945, it did so as a force of undeniable liberation, pushing back German armies that had devastated entire nations and dismantling the machinery of occupation across Eastern Europe. Cities like Warsaw and Budapest were left scarred and broken, their populations exhausted by years of brutality, hunger, and uncertainty. To many civilians, the arrival of Soviet troops meant the end of terror and the promise of stability, even if that stability was unfamiliar. Yet for Moscow, the military advance carried a deeper strategic meaning that extended far beyond the defeat of Nazi Germany. For Joseph Stalin, the war had reinforced a historical lesson that shaped every major decision he would make in the post-war order. Invasions of Russia and the Soviet Union had repeatedly come through the flat expanses of Eastern Europe, where weak or hostile governments provided corridors rather than barriers. The catastrophic losses of 1941 were not, in his interpretation, the result of ideological miscalculation alone, but of geopolitical exposure. If the Soviet Union was to survive in a world still dominated by powerful capitalist states, its western frontier could not remain politically unpredictable. Security demanded depth, and depth required influence over the governments that lay between Moscow and Berlin. As German forces retreated, provisional administrations began forming in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary under the shadow of the advancing Red Army. These governments often included a mixture of political factions, giving the outward appearance of coalition and cooperation, while key ministries such as Interior Affairs and Security gradually came under the control of figures aligned with Soviet interests. Elections were discussed and legal frameworks preserved, but the decisive levers of authority were carefully positioned. What emerged was not an abrupt revolution imposed overnight, but a steady recalibration of power that favored parties willing to coordinate closely with Moscow. Western observers initially struggled to interpret these developments, balancing gratitude for Soviet military sacrifice against growing concern over political consolidation in Eastern Europe. Publicly, the alliance still held, and diplomatic language emphasized reconstruction and shared victory. Privately, doubts intensified as reports described increasing pressure on opposition groups and tighter control over media and security forces. The line between protection and expansion began to blur, and the memory of wartime cooperation started to fade beneath the weight of emerging rivalry. For Stalin, however, the process was neither improvisation nor ideological crusade alone. It was the logical extension of a war fought at unimaginable cost. The Soviet Union would never again rely solely on treaties to guarantee its safety. If friendly governments could serve as buffers against future aggression, then shaping those governments became an act of strategic necessity. The Iron Curtain was not yet a declared boundary, but in the territories liberated by Soviet arms, its framework was quietly taking form. In February 1945, while the war still raged across the European continent, the leaders of the Allied powers gathered at the Crimean resort of Yalta to determine the structure of the post-war world. The setting appeared almost detached from the devastation elsewhere. Yet the conversations unfolding there would shape the fate of millions living far beyond the conference halls. Around the table sat Joseph Stalin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, each carrying distinct visions of security, governance, and international order. Though united by the necessity of defeating Nazi Germany, they were already divided by the principles that would define peace. The agreements announced at Yalta were framed in the language of cooperation and democratic reconstruction, promising free elections in liberated Europe and a collective approach to managing defeated Germany. On paper, the commitments appeared clear and mutually understood, yet beneath the diplomatic phrasing lay competing interpretations that would soon surface. For Roosevelt and Churchill, free elections implied competitive political systems open to multiple parties and public debate, reflecting Western democratic traditions. For Stalin, democracy could exist within a socialist framework guided by a dominant political force, provided that it maintained stability and alignment with Soviet security interests. The question of Poland revealed these differences most sharply, as it stood both symbolically and strategically at the center of post-war negotiations. To the Western Allies, Poland represented the original cause for entering the war in 1939 and thus demanded restoration of genuine sovereignty. To Stalin, Poland represented a historic invasion corridor and therefore required a government that would not threaten Soviet borders or invite hostile influence. The compromise language that emerged masked unresolved tension, allowing each side to believe it had preserved its essential interests. Yalta did not create the Iron Curtain, but it exposed the foundations upon which it would rise. The Red Army's position on the ground gave Stalin leverage that diplomacy alone could not counterbalance, and military reality inevitably shaped political outcomes. As delegates departed Crimea, the alliance still functioned publicly, yet trust had thinned into cautious calculation. What had begun as cooperation against a common enemy was gradually transforming into a contest over the meaning of security and the definition of freedom in post-war Europe. By the spring of 1945, Berlin had become more than the capital of a collapsing regime. It was the symbolic heart of a war that had consumed continents and redrawn the map of Europe. As Soviet forces encircled the city and fought their way street by street toward its political center, the battle carried both military and psychological weight. The fall of Berlin would mark the definitive defeat of Nazi Germany, but it would also determine who stood at the center of the new European balance of power. For Joseph Stalin, the capture of the German capital was not merely an operational objective. It was a statement about sacrifice, strength, and legitimacy. The Red Army's victory in Berlin came at enormous human cost, reinforcing the narrative that the Soviet Union had borne the decisive burden of the war in Europe. Entire Soviet divisions had been rebuilt multiple times since 1941, and the final assault on the city represented both closure and vindication. When Soviet troops raised their banner over the Reichstag, the image traveled far beyond Germany's borders, becoming a symbol of triumph that Moscow would invoke in the years to come. In Stalin's calculation, that victory justified not only reparations, but influence over the future political structure of Central and Eastern Europe. Yet even before the guns fell silent, agreements had been made to divide Germany into occupation zones controlled by the four major Allied powers. Berlin itself, though deep within the Soviet zone, would also be partitioned, creating a shared administration in a city that had just been conquered at extraordinary cost. On paper, this arrangement represented cooperation and collective responsibility for rebuilding a defeated nation. In practice, it embedded tension into the very heart of post-war Europe, placing Western enclaves inside territory secured by Soviet arms. As reconstruction began, differing philosophies quickly emerged regarding Germany's future. Soviet authorities prioritized dismantling industrial capacity and extracting reparations, aiming to ensure that Germany could never again threaten Soviet security. Western officials, increasingly concerned about economic collapse and political instability, emphasized recovery and gradual integration into a stable European system. These contrasting approaches transformed Berlin into more than a divided city. It became the front line of competing visions about how peace should be structured and who would shape it. The war in Europe had officially ended in May 1945, but in Berlin, a quieter struggle was already taking form. Administrative decisions, economic reforms, and political alignments began to carry strategic consequences that reached far beyond city limits. What had once been the epicenter of total war was now becoming the epicenter of a new geopolitical rivalry. The ruins of Berlin stood not only as evidence of destruction, but as the foundation upon which a divided Europe would be built. As the immediate shock of war began to settle, the political landscape of Eastern Europe entered a decisive phase of transformation that would define the region for decades. Soviet troops remained stationed across Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and later Czechoslovakia, their presence both a reminder of liberation and a guarantee of influence. Reconstruction governments formed under the banner of coalition and national renewal, often including multiple political factions that appeared to reflect broad representation. Yet beneath this surface pluralism, a gradual reordering of authority was taking place, guided by strategic direction from Moscow. For Joseph Stalin, the objective was not immediate annexation, but reliable alignment. Communist parties, many of which had been marginal before the war, were elevated into key positions within ministries that controlled security, communications, and internal administration. Elections were organized and legal frameworks maintained, but the decisive mechanisms of power were carefully consolidated in the hands of those who supported closer ties with the Soviet Union. This approach allowed transformation to unfold through formal procedures rather than overt conquest, giving the appearance of legality while ensuring predictable outcomes. Opposition parties were not always banned outright. Instead, they were weakened through investigation, accusation, and administrative pressure. Independent newspapers faced increasing regulation, and political leaders who resisted alignment found themselves marginalized or removed from office. Land reforms and industrial nationalization policies were introduced, appealing to populations exhausted by war and economic collapse. For many citizens, promises of stability, employment, and social restructuring offered tangible hope after years of devastation, even as political space narrowed around them. Economic integration soon followed political consolidation, binding Eastern European economies more closely to Moscow through trade agreements and coordinated production targets. Infrastructure was redirected to support regional interdependence under Soviet guidance, reinforcing a system in which national policies increasingly mirrored Soviet priorities. By the late 1940s, the pattern had become unmistakable. A bloc of states sharing similar political structures, security systems, and economic strategies had emerged across Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain was no longer simply a metaphor. It was an organized reality, built through institutions as much as ideology. In 1947, as Europe struggled with food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and collapsing currencies, the United States introduced a sweeping proposal aimed at stabilizing the continent's fragile economies. Announced by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, the European Recovery Program, soon known as the Marshall Plan, promised billions of dollars in financial aid to help rebuild industry, restore trade, and prevent political extremism fueled by desperation. The offer was presented as inclusive, theoretically open to all European nations, including those within the Soviet sphere. Yet beneath its economic framework lay a strategic calculation. Prosperity would serve as a barrier against communist expansion and solidify Western alignment. For Joseph Stalin, the Marshall Plan was not a neutral act of reconstruction, but an instrument of influence designed to pull Europe toward Washington. Accepting American aid would require economic transparency, coordination, and participation in structures that Moscow could not control. Such integration threatened to weaken Soviet leverage over Eastern Europe and expose the region to Western political ideas and market mechanisms. What appeared in the West as generosity appeared in Moscow as encirclement. Stalin quickly rejected participation and pressured Eastern European governments to do the same, even in countries where economic need was acute. Czechoslovakia, initially inclined to consider the offer, reversed its position under Soviet insistence, signaling that economic decisions within the emerging bloc would align with Moscow's priorities. In response, the Soviet Union intensified efforts to coordinate its own sphere, strengthening economic agreements and reinforcing political loyalty among allied governments. The choice was no longer simply about aid, it was about allegiance. The Marshall Plan deepened the structural division of Europe, accelerating recovery in the West, while isolating the East within a separate economic framework. As Western Europe began to stabilize and rebuild with American support, Eastern Europe turned inward, consolidating state control and tightening political discipline. Economic policy thus became an extension of geopolitical rivalry, and prosperity itself emerged as a strategic weapon. The Iron Curtain, once described in speeches, now took shape through trade routes, financial systems, and competing visions of Europe's future. By 1948, Berlin had transformed from a defeated capital into the most volatile pressure point of the emerging Cold War. The city remained divided into 4 occupation sectors, yet it lay deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany, creating a fragile arrangement dependent on cooperation that was steadily eroding. When Western authorities introduced currency reform in their sectors to stabilize the economy and combat inflation, Moscow interpreted the move as a step toward the creation of a separate West German state aligned with Washington. For Joseph Stalin, the reform represented both a political challenge and a test of resolve. In June 1948, Soviet authorities cut all ground access to West Berlin, blocking railways, roads, and canals that connected the western sectors to the outside world. The objective was not open warfare, but pressure, to force the Western allies to reconsider their policies or withdraw from the city entirely. West Berlin, home to more than 2 million civilians, suddenly faced isolation and potential economic collapse. What had begun as administrative disagreement now threatened to become a humanitarian crisis. The response from the United States and its allies was bold and unprecedented. Rather than abandon the city or confront the blockade with force, they launched a massive airlift to supply West Berlin with food, fuel, and essential goods. Aircraft landed around the clock, turning the skies above the city into a corridor of lifelines that demonstrated both logistical capacity and political determination. The operation avoided direct military confrontation while signaling that Western presence in Berlin would not be negotiated away under pressure. Each cargo plane became a symbol of commitment to a divided city. For Stalin, the blockade was a calculated risk intended to test Western endurance without triggering full-scale war. Yet the airlift undermined the strategy, transforming a display of Soviet leverage into a demonstration of Western unity and resilience. After nearly a year, the blockade was lifted in May 1949, but the confrontation left lasting consequences. Germany would soon be formally divided into 2 states, and Berlin would remain a permanent fault line in Europe's political geography. The crisis revealed how quickly rivalry could escalate and how carefully both sides maneuvered to avoid direct conflict. The Iron Curtain was no longer abstract rhetoric or gradual institutional change. It was reinforced by physical barriers, air corridors, and hardened alliances. Berlin had survived the blockade, but it had also confirmed that the wartime alliance was irreversibly fractured. The Cold War had entered a new and more visible phase. The Berlin Blockade did more than test endurance. It reshaped strategic thinking across the Atlantic. Western leaders had already grown wary of Soviet consolidation in Eastern Europe, but the events of 1948 convinced many that informal cooperation was no longer sufficient to guarantee security. The airlift had succeeded without open conflict, yet it underscored how vulnerable Western Europe remained in the face of concentrated Soviet power. Out of that realization emerged a decisive shift. Security would now be institutionalized through collective defense. In April 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating what became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The agreement established that an attack against one member would be considered an attack against all, formalizing military coordination between the United States, Canada, and Western European states. For countries still recovering from war, the alliance represented both protection and reassurance, binding American military power directly to European stability. It marked the first peacetime military alliance the United States had entered into outside the Western Hemisphere, signaling a permanent commitment to European affairs. From Moscow's perspective, NATO confirmed long-held suspicions that the West sought to contain and encircle the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin viewed the alliance not as defensive, but as a strategic bloc positioned along the Soviet frontier. The formation of a unified Western military structure reinforced the logic of tightening control within the Eastern sphere, ensuring that political loyalty would match the emerging military alignment on the other side. What had begun as ideological rivalry was now backed by formal military architecture. The establishment of NATO accelerated the crystallization of two opposing systems in Europe. Western Europe integrated economically and militarily under American leadership, while Eastern Europe remained bound to Moscow through political coordination and security oversight. The possibility of returning to a cooperative post-war framework diminished further as both sides institutionalized their alliances. The Iron Curtain was no longer only a political boundary. It was reinforced by treaties, defense planning, and an escalating arms competition. By 1949, the division of Europe had moved beyond rhetoric and crisis management into permanent structure. Alliances were signed, borders hardened, and strategic doctrines rewritten around the expectation of long-term rivalry. The Second World War had ended only 4 years earlier, yet the foundations of a new global confrontation were firmly in place. The world was entering an era defined not by open battlefields, but by sustained tension and mutual deterrence. By 1949, the temporary occupation of Germany had evolved into a permanent political division that reflected the broader fracture of Europe. The Western zones, administered by the United States, Britain, and France, began coordinating their economic systems and political institutions in response to mounting instability and the pressures of the Berlin crisis. Currency reform, constitutional drafting, and reconstruction programs laid the groundwork for a new federal structure intended to anchor Germany within a stable Western framework. In May 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was formally established, signaling that the western half of the country would align with the Atlantic Alliance and emerging democratic institutions. Moscow interpreted this development as a decisive shift toward confrontation rather than compromise. For Joseph Stalin, the creation of a West German state tied to Western powers threatened to revive the very geopolitical risks the Soviet Union sought to prevent after 1945. In response, Soviet authorities consolidated their own zone of occupation, shaping administrative structures, security systems, and economic planning along socialist lines. By October 1949, the German Democratic Republic was proclaimed in the East, formalizing a division that had already become political reality. The emergence of two German states transformed the map of Europe and crystallized the ideological confrontation between East and West. Each government claimed legitimacy, each promoted its own narrative of reconstruction, and each became a symbol of the system it represented. In the West, integration into European recovery and transatlantic institutions emphasized economic revival and pluralist governance. In the East, centralized planning and alignment with Moscow reinforced the model of socialist transformation under Soviet guidance. Berlin remained divided within a divided country, embodying the tension that now defined the continent. Families, industries, and transportation networks were split by administrative boundaries that soon hardened into political barriers. What had once been the epicenter of Nazi power had become the most visible manifestation of Cold War division. Germany's partition was no longer a provisional arrangement born of wartime necessity. It was the structural confirmation that Europe had separated into two opposing blocs. The creation of two Germanys marked a decisive stage in the consolidation of the Iron Curtain. The boundary between influence and allegiance was now formalized in constitutions, flags, and international recognition. The question was no longer whether Europe would remain united after the war, but how long this new division would endure. In the shadow of recent victory, a new and more enduring confrontation had taken shape at the very heart of the continent. By the early 1950s, the political architecture of Eastern Europe had largely solidified, but the true measure of transformation lay not only in treaties and ministries, but in the daily rhythms of ordinary life. Borders that had once been administrative lines hardened into guarded frontiers, limiting movement and reshaping personal connections across the continent. Travel permits became instruments of control, and information from the West was filtered through tightly regulated channels. The Iron Curtain was no longer just a geopolitical phrase. It was a lived reality that influenced careers, education, and even private conversations. Under the guidance of Moscow, governments across the Eastern Bloc implemented centralized economic planning designed to accelerate industrial recovery and reduce reliance on Western markets. Factories were nationalized, agricultural land reorganized, and production quotas established in accordance with state objectives. For many citizens, these policies brought rapid industrial employment and expanded access to education, particularly in urban centers that had been devastated by war. Yet the same system demanded conformity, and dissent, whether political or cultural, carried consequences enforced by expanding security services. For Joseph Stalin, internal cohesion within the Eastern sphere was inseparable from external security. Loyalty to the socialist model ensured that the buffer zone he had envisioned after 1945 would remain stable and aligned with Soviet interests. Party structures penetrated deeply into workplaces, universities, and media institutions, shaping narratives about reconstruction and vigilance against external threats. Ideology became both a unifying doctrine and a mechanism for maintaining discipline within societies still recovering from war. In contrast, Western Europe experienced accelerated economic revival through integration and external investment, reinforcing the visible divergence between the two halves of the continent. The difference in consumer goods, infrastructure renewal, and political openness gradually became part of the Cold War's psychological dimension. Each system presented itself as the more legitimate path to stability and progress, and citizens on both sides observed the other with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The divide was no longer abstract diplomacy. It was measurable in standards of living, public discourse, and the degree of individual mobility. The consolidation of everyday life behind the Iron Curtain marked a turning point in the Cold War's evolution. What began as wartime necessity had matured into a comprehensive system of governance and identity. The line separating East and West was sustained not only by armies and alliances, but by habits, institutions, and carefully constructed narratives. Europe had entered an era in which division was normalized, and the structures created in the aftermath of World War II would define generations to come. As Europe adjusted to political division and hardened alliances, a new dimension of power began to overshadow traditional military calculations. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending the brief American monopoly on nuclear weapons and transforming the strategic balance almost overnight. The explosion did not occur on European soil, yet its consequences were felt immediately across the continent, where both blocs were now positioned within striking distance of one another. The existence of nuclear parity introduced a new logic into global politics, one in which total war promised mutual destruction rather than decisive victory. For Joseph Stalin, the development of atomic capability was both a defensive necessity and a symbol of technological achievement. The Soviet Union had emerged from World War II devastated economically, yet it had demonstrated that it could compete with the industrial and scientific capacity of the United States. Nuclear weapons provided not only deterrence, but leverage in diplomatic negotiations, reinforcing the security buffer Stalin had sought to construct in Eastern Europe. The arms race that followed would demand immense resources, reshaping economic priorities and scientific research across the Soviet sphere. In the West, the Soviet test confirmed fears that the ideological conflict could escalate beyond conventional confrontation. Defense planning shifted rapidly, and strategies of containment were now accompanied by doctrines of deterrence designed to prevent direct military engagement. Military alliances gained renewed urgency, and technological innovation became inseparable from geopolitical rivalry. The Cold War was no longer confined to political systems or economic models. It had entered the realm of existential risk. The nuclear shadow altered the psychology of leadership on both sides. Decisions carried consequences measured not only in territorial gains, but in the survival of entire populations. Public discourse increasingly reflected the awareness that another global war might not resemble the last. It could be faster, more devastating, and impossible to contain. In Europe, where two heavily armed blocs faced each other across a divided Germany, the presence of atomic weapons intensified caution even as suspicion deepened. The emergence of nuclear deterrence did not soften the Iron Curtain, but it changed the way confrontation unfolded beneath it. Proxy conflicts, intelligence operations, and political competition would define the coming decades, while direct military collision remained constrained by the fear of irreversible catastrophe. The world had moved beyond the battlefield logic of 1945 into a precarious equilibrium shaped by technology and mistrust. Under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union had secured its sphere of influence, but it now existed within a balance where power and vulnerability were inseparably linked. By the early 1950s, the division of Europe had matured into a structured and enduring system rather than a temporary consequence of war. The Eastern Bloc was no longer a loose collection of Soviet-influenced governments, but a coordinated political sphere shaped by shared institutions, security agreements, and economic integration. Communist parties dominated public life across the region, presenting themselves as guardians of reconstruction and stability after years of devastation. Beneath this outward unity, however, the memory of how quickly power had shifted in the late 1940s remained vivid, reinforcing the centrality of discipline and control. Within the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin oversaw a system that linked ideology with state authority at every level of governance. Party structures penetrated ministries, factories, schools, and cultural institutions, ensuring that political alignment extended beyond formal leadership into daily administration. Trials and internal investigations within Eastern European states signaled that deviation from the approved line would not be tolerated, even among senior officials. The message was clear. Loyalty to Moscow was not merely diplomatic courtesy, but structural necessity. Economic coordination intensified as production targets and trade agreements aligned Eastern Europe more tightly with Soviet planning priorities. Heavy industry, energy, and infrastructure projects were emphasized, often at the expense of consumer goods and agricultural balance. While industrial output rose in several sectors, shortages and inefficiencies became recurring challenges, shaping public perception of the socialist model. Nevertheless, the leadership framed these sacrifices as temporary costs of long-term security and modernization. Culturally and politically, the divide between East and West grew sharper. Media narratives portrayed Western capitalism as unstable and aggressive, while presenting the socialist bloc as a community of nations united against external pressure. In Western Europe, integration and recovery continued under American partnership, reinforcing the contrast in economic organization and political pluralism. The ideological competition thus moved beyond borders into the realm of legitimacy, as each system claimed to represent the future. By the time Stalin entered the final years of his life, the architecture of the Iron Curtain had become embedded in treaties, institutions, and social expectations. The buffer zone he had envisioned after 1945 was firmly in place, and the Soviet Union stood at the center of a bloc defined by alignment rather than occupation alone. What had begun as wartime security calculation had evolved into a geopolitical order that would outlast its architect. The system was no longer experimental or provisional. It had hardened into permanence. By the beginning of the 1950s, the Soviet Union stood at the height of its territorial influence, yet internally it carried the weight of constant vigilance and political tension. Reconstruction from the devastation of World War II had progressed unevenly, with heavy industry expanding rapidly while consumer life remained constrained. The state projected strength abroad, but at home, the atmosphere was marked by suspicion and renewed campaigns against perceived internal threats. The security apparatus, refined over decades, continued to operate as an instrument of discipline and control. For Joseph Stalin, the consolidation of the Eastern Bloc did not eliminate the fear of ideological erosion or conspiracy. Political trials in several Eastern European countries during this period reflected both loyalty tests and a broader anxiety about deviation from Moscow's line. Within the Soviet Union itself, rhetoric about vigilance intensified, reinforcing the idea that external encirclement required unwavering unity. The memory of invasion and war remained central to official narratives, serving as justification for continued centralization. Internationally, the Cold War expanded beyond Europe, with crises emerging in Asia that further entrenched global rivalry. The Soviet leadership observed these developments through the lens of balance and deterrence, recognizing that the nuclear dimension of the conflict made direct confrontation increasingly dangerous. Yet competition persisted through alliances, economic influence, and support for aligned movements abroad. The geopolitical order that had formed after 1945 now extended far beyond the European continent. As Stalin's health declined in the early 1950s, the system he had shaped operated with rigid predictability, but also underlying uncertainty about succession. The concentration of authority in one leader had ensured decisive direction, yet it left little clarity about transition. When he died in March 1953, the event marked not only the end of a personal era, but the conclusion of a formative chapter in post-war Europe. The Iron Curtain remained firmly in place, but its architect was gone. Stalin's final years revealed the paradox of his legacy, a state secure in its borders, yet constrained by its own mechanisms of control. The structures he built endured, shaping the trajectory of the Cold War for decades. Europe's division had become institutional, normalized, and reinforced by habit as much as policy. His death would open the possibility of change, but the system he constructed would prove far more resilient than the man himself. When Joseph Stalin died in March 1953, the reaction across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was immediate and profound. Official mourning ceremonies projected unity and reverence, presenting his leadership as the force that had secured victory in war and stability in peace. Yet beneath the solemn processions lay uncertainty, as senior officials in Moscow began navigating the delicate question of succession within a system built around concentrated authority. The absence of a single dominant figure exposed the complexity of governing an empire of influence that stretched across half of Europe. In the months that followed, a cautious recalibration emerged within Soviet leadership circles. While the core structure of the Eastern Bloc remained intact, certain policies began to soften, reflecting recognition that rigid control carried long-term risks. Discussions of reform, economic adjustment, and limited political reconsideration hinted at the possibility of change, though always within the boundaries of maintaining Soviet security interests. The Iron Curtain did not lift, but its maintenance now required negotiation among leaders rather than unilateral direction. Across Eastern Europe, governments watched Moscow closely, aware that any shift at the center could ripple outward. Popular expectations varied, shaped by years of discipline and propaganda, yet also by the hope that transition might ease political pressure. In some states, modest reforms were tested, while in others, party structures tightened to prevent instability. The bloc remained aligned, but the tone of leadership began to evolve as the Cold War entered a new phase. Internationally, Western governments interpreted Stalin's death as a potential turning point, though caution tempered optimism. The nuclear balance persisted, alliances remained firm, and ideological rivalry showed no sign of disappearing. Yet, diplomacy gradually resumed in new forms, shaped by the recognition that total confrontation carried unacceptable risks. The world had adjusted to the permanence of division, and now it would adjust to the absence of the man who had helped define it. Stalin's passing did not dismantle the system he created, but it altered its trajectory. The Iron Curtain endured as a geopolitical reality, sustained by institutions and strategic logic rather than by one individual's will. Europe remained divided, yet the mechanisms of rivalry became more complex and, at times, more flexible. The architect was gone, but the structure stood, poised to shape the second half of the 20th century. By the mid-20th century, the division of Europe had evolved from wartime contingency into a defining feature of global politics. The line that stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic was not simply a boundary on a map, but a separation of systems, economies, and worldviews that shaped everyday life for hundreds of millions of people. What began as a strategic calculation in the aftermath of invasion hardened into an enduring geopolitical structure sustained by alliances, ideology, and nuclear deterrence. The continent that had ignited 2 world wars now stood frozen in a tense equilibrium between rival blocs. The legacy of Joseph Stalin was inseparable from this transformation. His insistence on strategic depth and aligned governments created a buffer that he believed essential for Soviet survival, and in doing so, he helped define the opening decades of the Cold War. The Eastern Bloc, constructed through a combination of military presence, political restructuring, and economic integration, remained intact long after his death. Yet the very mechanisms designed to guarantee security also entrenched division, limiting exchange and reinforcing suspicion across the European landscape. In the West, the response to that division fostered its own institutions and identity, strengthening transatlantic cooperation and accelerating economic integration. 2 contrasting models of governance developed side by side, each claiming legitimacy and historical necessity. The Cold War that followed did not erupt into direct large-scale war in Europe, in part because the balance of power and nuclear deterrence imposed caution. Nevertheless, the ideological competition permeated diplomacy, culture, science, and daily life for decades. The Iron Curtain would eventually lift, but its impact endured in memories, political institutions, and the reshaped geography of the continent. Cities divided by ideology would confront reunification, and societies shaped by centralized control would navigate transformation. The story of Stalin and the system he built is therefore not only about consolidation of power, but about the long shadow cast by decisions made in the aftermath of catastrophe. It is a reminder that the end of one war can mark the beginning of a different kind of struggle. One fought not only with armies, but with ideas, alliances, and the enduring quest for security. Europe emerged from the Second World War determined never to repeat its destruction, yet it entered a new era defined by guarded peace rather than harmony. The man behind the Iron Curtain sought to prevent future invasion through control and alignment, and in doing so reshaped the 20th century. His legacy remains woven into the history of divided Europe, a testament to how fear, power, and ideology can redraw the world long after the guns fall silent.